He publicly rejected his fated mate, expecting tears and desperate begging. Instead, she looked him dead in the eye, permanently severed their sacred bond, and walked away without a single tear. By the time the brutal Alpha King realized his fatal mistake, she was already gone. Now, the most powerful beast in the realm is on his knees, tearing his kingdom apart for a woman who no longer loves him. Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more. The heavy oak doors of the ancient hall slammed shut. Silence descended upon the gathered pack like a thick suffocating blanket. Hundreds of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder in the flickering torchlight. Every single eye was locked on me. They were waiting for my world to completely shatter. Caleb stood at the very center of the elevated stone dais. He was the undisputed Alpha King of our territories. His massive frame radiated an overwhelming and dominant authority. He was incredibly tall and brutally muscular. His broad shoulders stretched the dark leather of his royal tunic. His dark hair was cut short and neatly styled. It perfectly framed his harsh and angular jawline. His glowing amber eyes held absolutely no warmth as they pierced through mine. I stood alone at the bottom of the cold stone steps. I wore the silver ceremonial gown meant for a new Luna. The expensive silk felt heavy and freezing against my skin. Evelyn, his deep voice rumbled through the cavernous room. The harsh sound vibrated directly into my bones. I cannot accept you as my fated mate. Loud gasps echoed from the dark corners of the hall. Elders shifted uncomfortably on their wooden thrones. The cruel words hung suspended in the chilling air. It was the ultimate humiliation for any female wolf. To be publicly rejected by the king was a death sentence to one's reputation. Caleb looked down at me with a mixture of pity and stern resolve. He expected me to fall to my trembling knees. He waited for the inevitable tears to stream down my face. He braced himself for the desperate and pathetic begging. That was how it always happened in the old historical tales. A rejected mate would grovel and plead for a sliver of mercy. But my eyes remained completely dry. My heartbeat steadied calmly inside my chest. I felt an unexpected wave of pure clarity wash over my mind. I looked at this powerful man who had just destroyed my future. I saw nothing but a stranger standing on a pedestal of his own ego. You are beautiful, Evelyn, Caleb continued with a rigid tone. But beauty does not win brutal territorial wars. My pack requires a ruthless warrior to stand beside me. I need a queen forged in blood, not sheltered in silk. He was entirely convinced of his own blind righteousness. He genuinely believed he was making a noble sacrifice for his people. He thought he was sparing me from a violent life I could not handle. I did not argue with his deeply flawed logic. I did not try to prove my inner strength to a man who only respected claws. I simply took a slow and deliberate breath. I raised my chin and met his dominating gaze without flinching. I understand, I replied. My voice was clear and perfectly steady. It cut through the heavy silence like a sharpened silver blade. Caleb blinked, a brief flash of pure confusion crossing his stoic features. His strong jaw tightened slightly in mild irritation. He clearly anticipated a dramatic emotional breakdown. My calm demeanor was a complete deviation from his expected script. You understand, he repeated slowly. Yes, Alpha, I said, using his formal title to sever our personal connection. I accept your rejection. The entire hall erupted into frantic and bewildered whispers. No female had ever accepted a royal rejection so swiftly. No one had ever surrendered the crown without a desperate fight. I ignored the loud murmurs and simply closed my eyes. I reached deep into the silent core of my soul. I found the glowing golden thread of our sacred mate bond. It was a fragile tether that connected my spirit directly to his. It pulsed with a faint and unrequited longing. With a mental strike of absolute willpower, I severed the connection. A sharp pain bloomed in my chest, but I swallowed it down instantly. The golden thread snapped violently in the spiritual plane. The physical recoil was immediate and totally undeniable. Caleb staggered back a clumsy half-step on the royal dais. His large hands instinctively grabbed his broad chest. His amber eyes widened in sudden, raw, unfiltered shock. He felt the abrupt and terrifying emptiness where my soul had been anchored to his. He never expected me to initiate the final permanent break. He foolishly thought he would be the one in total control of the severing. I turned my back on the stunned Alpha King. I did not look at the pale elders or the whispering crowd. I picked up the heavy silver skirts of my useless gown. I began to walk toward the massive oak doors at the far end of the hall. Each of my footsteps echoed loudly against the ancient stone floor. The gathered pack instinctively parted for me like the Red Sea. They lowered their heads, unsure if they were witnessing a disgrace or a triumph. I walked with my spine perfectly straight and my shoulders squared. I was no longer the pathetic rejected mate. I was the resilient woman who had just walked away from the throne. Evelyn, wait, Caleb's voice cracked loudly. The undeniable tremor in his deep tones sent a massive shockwave through the room. The Alpha King never hesitated in his life. The Alpha King never sounded desperate. I did not pause my determined stride. I did not look back over my shoulder for even a second. I reached out and pushed the heavy iron handles of the giant doors. The cool night air rushed in to warmly greet me. It smelled of wild freedom and fresh pine needles. Behind me, a low, guttural growl began to violently build in Caleb's throat. It was not a sound of majestic royal authority. It was the terrifying sound of an alpha losing his absolute mind. But that was no longer my problem to solve. I stepped out into the surrounding darkness and let the heavy doors slam shut behind me. The freezing wind immediately caught my long flowing hair. It whipped the dark strands aggressively across my face. I embraced the biting winter cold as a comforting protective shield. Inside the fortress walls, pure chaos suddenly erupted. I could hear the frantic shouts of the elite royal guards. I could hear the heavy wooden thrones scraping violently against the stone floor. But above all the chaotic noise, one single sound dominated the night. It was a terrifying, earth-shattering roar of absolute agony. Caleb was literally tearing the grand hall apart. His legendary emotional control had completely vanished the moment I disappeared from his sight. The strong, unshakable leader was entirely gone. Only a broken, panicked beast remained in his ruined place. He had arrogantly thrown away his most precious treasure. He only realized its true worth the exact second it was forever out of his reach. I kept walking steadily toward the edge of the dark ancient forest. I did not shed a single tear for the king who cast me aside. My real life was finally just beginning. The freezing winter wind howled through the towering pine trees. I walked steadily into the dark heart of the ancient forest. My thin silver shoes sank deep into the fresh snow with every single step. I should have been freezing to death in this delicate ceremonial gown. Instead, a strange and powerful warmth radiated from deep inside my chest. It was the burning fire of absolute liberation. For years, I had molded myself to be the perfect submissive Luna. I had silenced my own opinions to stroke the massive ego of the Alpha King. I had endured the whispers of the elders who called me too soft for their brutal world. Now, all of those suffocating expectations were left behind in that stone hall. I stopped under the thick branches of a massive ancient oak tree. My fingers grabbed the heavy silver clasps of my formal royal cloak. I ripped the expensive fabric away from my shoulders and let it fall. It landed in the pure white snow like a discarded piece of trash. I felt instantly lighter. I ran my hands through my long hair, letting the wild wind tangle the strands. I was young, I was beautiful, and I was finally entirely my own. I did not need a man to validate my existence in this harsh world. I certainly did not need a mate who viewed my kindness as a fatal weakness. I resumed my steady march toward the northern border of the territory. There was a deep, fast-flowing river that separated our lands from the unclaimed wilderness. That river was my final destination for the night. Once I crossed those rushing waters, I would never return. Back in the fortress, the reality of my departure was destroying the throne room. Caleb fell heavily to his knees on the cold stone dais. His tall and muscular body convulsed violently. The sudden severing of our fated bond acted like a physical poison in his veins. His perfectly styled short hair was now disheveled and soaked in cold sweat. He gripped his chest, his sharp claws digging deeply through his leather tunic. He was desperately trying to hold his shattered soul together. "Alpha," his lead enforcer shouted, rushing forward with a panic-stricken face. "Do not touch me," Caleb roared, his voice completely unrecognizable. The terrifying sound echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings. It was a mixture of pure rage and absolute, unfiltered terror. He swiped a massive arm through the air, sending the enforcer crashing into a stone pillar. No one dared to approach the breaking king after that. The entire pack watched in silent horror as their invincible leader crumbled. Caleb slammed his large fists into the stone floor, cracking the ancient tiles. He was bleeding, but he could not feel his bruised knuckles. The only pain that registered was the massive, gaping hole in his spirit. He closed his amber eyes and tried to reach out through the mental link. He expected to find my presence hovering nearby, crying and waiting for him. He thought he would easily reel me back in with a single authoritative command. But when he cast his consciousness into the void, he hit a solid wall of nothingness. The golden thread that once connected us was entirely gone. Not just faded, not just strained, but eradicated from existence. A fresh wave of sickening nausea washed over the strong Alpha. I had not just walked out the door, I had erased him from my soul. The sheer finality of my action hit his arrogant mind like a falling boulder. He stumbled to his feet, his massive chest heaving with erratic breaths. He did not issue any orders to his terrified council. He did not look at the faces of the wolves he claimed to protect. He simply turned and sprinted toward the open oak doors. His body shifted mid-stride, bones breaking and reforming in a split second. A monstrous, pitch-black wolf burst out into the raging snowstorm. His powerful paws tore up the frozen ground as he desperately chased my scent. He ran faster than he had ever run in his long, violent life. The trees blurred past him in a dark, chaotic rush. He needed to see me, to stop me, to force the bond back into place. He finally reached the edge of the deep pine forest. He skidded to a sudden halt, his sharp claws carving deep trenches into the ice. He could smell the faint trace of my lavender perfume hanging in the cold air. But he also saw the discarded silver cloak resting on the snowdrift. It looked exactly like a tombstone marking the death of our relationship. The giant black wolf let out a long, haunting whimper. It was the tragic sound of a devastating and permanent loss. He stared toward the distant rushing river, realizing he was already too late. I was gone, and his nightmare was just beginning. The sound of the roaring river grew louder with every step I took. The dark water violently crashed against the jagged rocks. It was a natural boundary that separated the known territories from the absolute wild. I stood on the snowy bank and stared into the turbulent currents. Frost clung to the bottom edges of my ruined silk gown. My bare arms were numb from the biting winter cold. Yet, I felt an intense fire burning deep within my veins. I was no longer the obedient girl who needed a castle for protection. I stepped cautiously onto the ancient, moss-covered stone bridge. The icy spray of the river hit my face like tiny glass shards. I did not flinch or turn back toward the safety of the fortress. Safety under Caleb's rule was nothing but a gilded cage. He wanted a warrior queen forged in blood. He completely failed to recognize the quiet, enduring strength it took to survive his arrogant court. I reached the exact center of the stone bridge. I paused for a single, brief moment. I allowed myself to mourn the naive dreams I once held. I had genuinely believed we were destined to lead the pack together. I had spent years studying the ancient laws and preparing to be his Luna. But destiny was a lie constructed by the powerful to control the weak. I took a deep breath of the freezing, damp air. I let go of the past completely and crossed into the unclaimed lands. The moment my silver shoes touched the opposite bank, a profound shift occurred in the atmosphere. The heavy, oppressive aura of Caleb's territory vanished entirely. I was a rogue now, a wolf without a pack. Surprisingly, the thought did not terrify me at all. It felt like the very first breath of fresh air after nearly drowning. The unclaimed wilderness was notorious for its hidden dangers and ruthless rogue packs. Elders told horrific stories about females who wandered too far from their alphas. They used fear to keep us compliant and blindly bound to the territory. But the towering pines standing before me did not look like monsters. They looked like ancient guardians welcoming a lost daughter home. The moonlight filtered through the thick canopy, casting silver shadows on the snow. I pulled my thin dress tighter around my freezing body. I needed to find shelter before the temperature dropped any further. My survival instincts, dormant for so long in the castle, sharply awakened. I focused my heightened senses on the subtle sounds of the forest. I listened to the rustling of small animals and the creaking of old branches. I was entirely focused on the present moment and my own survival. The ghost of Caleb's harsh voice no longer haunted my thoughts. The sting of public humiliation had completely evaporated. I continued walking into the dense, dark woods ahead without looking back. Meanwhile, a massive black beast burst through the tree line on the other side. Caleb skidded to a violent halt at the edge of the roaring river. His massive chest heaved with brutal, agonizing gasps. His sharp claws dug helplessly into the frozen earth. He scanned the turbulent water and the empty bridge with desperate amber eyes. The scent of lavender and snow ended abruptly at the stone steps. The rushing river completely washed away any physical trace of my path. He let out a devastating, guttural howl that tore through the night sky. The sound was thick with raw agony and crushing despair. It was the cry of a dominant king who had just shattered his own world. He paced frantically along the snowy bank like a trapped animal. His mind was a whirlwind of dark regret and absolute panic. He had built his entire reign on the foundation of cold logic and brute strength. He believed emotions were a severe vulnerability that enemies could exploit. He thought discarding his gentle mate would solidify his ruthless reputation. Instead, it had fundamentally broken him from the inside out. The severing of the mate bond was a constant, throbbing wound in his chest. It felt like his heart was being slowly crushed by an invisible iron fist. He shifted back into his tall, muscular human form. He collapsed heavily onto the freezing, snow-covered rocks. His strong frame trembled uncontrollably in the harsh winter wind. He buried his face in his large, scarred hands. The proud, short-haired Alpha King was reduced to a weeping, broken shell. He remembered the calm clarity in my eyes when I accepted his rejection. He remembered how I did not shed a single tear for him. That memory was a poisoned blade twisting deep in his gut. He realized his immense physical power could not force me to return. His vast armies could not conquer the silent void left in his soul. He had commanded absolute submission from everyone around him. But he could not command a severed bond to magically heal. The cold truth washed over him like the freezing river water. He had arrogantly thrown away the only person who saw the man beneath the crown. On the opposite shore, His pain was rapidly morphing into dangerous obsession. He stared at the spot where he assumed I had crossed. His golden eyes burned with a feverish, unhealthy intensity. He desperately wanted to dive into the icy currents and swim across. He wanted to tear through the unclaimed lands and drag me back to his throne. But crossing the river without a formal declaration meant initiating a massive territorial war. The neighboring wild clans would slaughter his pack if he invaded blindly. For the first time in his reign, his duty to his people paralyzed his personal desires. He was trapped between his heavy crown and his bleeding soul. The realization of his absolute helplessness was maddening. He let out another agonizing roar, punching the solid rock beside him. The stone cracked under his immense strength, tearing the skin from his knuckles. The physical pain did absolutely nothing to dull the spiritual agony. He stared at his bleeding hands, watching the red drops stain the white snow. Blood was the currency he understood best. He thought blood and power were all that mattered to a king. He never realized that a kingdom built without a Luna was merely a barren wasteland. His council of elders had strongly advised him to reject me. They had poisoned his mind with whispers of my supposed fragility. A sudden, dark rage ignited in his hollow chest toward those old men. He would return to the fortress, but he would not return as their obedient puppet. The king they easily manipulated was dead, killed by the severing of the mate bond. A new, dangerously unstable beast was taking his place. He slowly pushed himself up from the snowy ground. His tall frame cast a long, terrifying shadow in the pale moonlight. He cast one final, longing look at the dark forest across the river. He swore a silent, brutal oath to the winter stars. He would find a way to cross that water, even if it cost him everything. The first rays of dawn finally broke through the dense canopy of the unclaimed wilderness. I opened my tired eyes and breathed in the extremely crisp morning air. I had successfully survived my very first night entirely alone in the brutal wild. There were absolutely no soft silk sheets or warm castle fireplaces out here. My delicate silver ceremonial gown was completely ruined by dark dirt and frozen dew. Yet, I had never felt more beautifully and undeniably alive in my entire existence. I sat up slowly and brushed the dried winter leaves from my tangled hair. The phantom ache of the violently severed mate bond was completely gone. In its hollow place was a solid, undeniable core of unbreakable resolve. I walked steadily toward a small frozen stream to wash my face. The freezing water was a harsh but incredibly welcome shock to my nervous system. I stared directly at my reflection in the dark, icy surface of the water. The submissive, terrified girl who stood weeping in that throne room was dead. A fiercely independent woman looked right back at me. I was young, I was beautiful, and I was entirely capable of carving out my own destiny. I absolutely did not need a powerful alpha to validate my existence or protect my life. I gathered sharp stones and sturdy fallen branches to fashion a rudimentary spear. My deliberate movements were surprisingly quick and instinctually precise. The royal elders had always whispered that my delicate bloodline was far too weak. They had successfully convinced Caleb that I would crumble under the heavy pressure of leadership. They were entirely and fatally wrong about everything regarding my true nature. The vast wildness of the dark forest did not intimidate me in the slightest. It actively welcomed me as a long-lost daughter returning to her rightful home. I spent the daylight hours tracking small game and learning the rough terrain. Every successful catch filled my chest with a deep, profound sense of genuine pride. I was actively building a brand new life from the cold ashes of my ultimate humiliation. The fire crackled loudly, sending tiny orange sparks into the cold night air. I watched them drift upwards and disappear completely into the surrounding darkness. It was a beautiful metaphor for my past life in the grand winter fortress. It was brief, tightly controlled, and ultimately extinguished by harsh reality. I took a bite of the roasted meat, savoring the simple, hard-earned flavor. It tasted infinitely better than the lavish, extravagant banquets I used to attend. Those royal banquets were filled with fake smiles and hidden political daggers. Here in the wild, there were no lies, no expectations, and absolutely no betrayals. Miles away, on the other side of the roaring river, pure unadulterated chaos reigned. The formidable and structured winter fortress had transformed into a terrifying nightmare. Caleb stormed aggressively through the heavy oak doors of the Grand Council chamber. His incredibly tall, muscular frame blocked out the pale morning light from the hallway. His usually neat short hair was wild and completely unkempt. His glowing amber eyes were heavily bloodshot and burned with a murderous, unhinged fury. The 5 ruling elders sat stiffly around the ancient circular stone table. They froze in absolute terror as their unstable sovereign entered the quiet room. They had foolishly expected him to return from the snowstorm humbled and ready to listen. They severely underestimated the catastrophic psychological damage of a broken mate bond. Alpha, the head elder began, his voice trembling uncontrollably in the tense silence. We must discuss the immediate selection of a more suitable and stronger Luna. That single, arrogant sentence instantly sealed their horrific and bloody fate. Caleb did not speak a single word in response to the elder's demand. He crossed the massive room in 3 terrifyingly fast and powerful strides. He grabbed the head elder by the throat and lifted him entirely off the stone ground. The older wolf gasped loudly and clawed helplessly at the king's thick, muscular arm. "You poisoned my mind," Caleb finally growled, his voice a demonic, unnatural rasp. "You told me she was fragile and utterly worthless to this great pack." He threw the helpless elder violently against the far stone wall. The sickening crack of breaking bones echoed loudly in the painfully silent chamber. The remaining 4 elders scrambled backwards in pure, unfiltered panic. They realized far too late that they had confidently unleashed a monster. "She was my absolute everything," Caleb roared, violently kicking the heavy stone table over. The massive piece of ancient furniture shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. "And you convinced me to throw her away like she was meaningless garbage." He paced the ruined room like a caged beast starved for fresh blood. The severing of the fated bond had stripped away every ounce of his legendary self-control. His immense physical strength was no longer a protective shield for his people. It was a deadly, unpredictable weapon fueled by unimaginable grief and endless regret. He looked down blankly at his trembling, blood-stained hands. He had built his entire vast kingdom on logic, strategy, and ruthless ambition. He had arrogantly sacrificed his own heart on the cold altar of public duty. Now, he possessed all the power in the world but had absolutely nothing to live for. "Gather the elite guard," Caleb commanded, turning to his terrified enforcer in the doorway. The heavily armed enforcer bowed instantly, his eyes wide with raw fear. "We are marching heavily to the northern border," Caleb stated with chilling finality. "But Alpha, the river is the absolute boundary," the brave enforcer dared to whisper. "Crossing it without provocation means open and bloody war with the wild clans." Caleb turned his head slowly, his amber eyes completely devoid of any remaining sanity. "Then let the deep rivers run entirely red with their blood." He did not care about the ancient treaties or the strict territorial laws anymore. He did not care if his entire grand kingdom burned to the ground in the process. He was going to tear the unclaimed wilderness apart tree by ancient tree. He was going to aggressively find the remarkable woman he foolishly rejected. He was desperate to see her face again, even if she hated him for the rest of eternity. He would much rather be the ultimate villain in her story than exist in a world without her. He ran a shaking hand through his short, messy hair, trying to steady his breathing. His tall, dominant silhouette cast a long, terrifying shadow over the ruined council room. He was a king who had finally realized the true, devastating cost of his arrogance. The heavy armories were thrown wide open, and the sound of sharpening steel filled the air. Caleb stood on the high balcony overlooking the busy, chaotic courtyard. The freezing winter wind whipped violently around his tall, muscular body. He wore his black battle armor, the heavy metal plates secured tightly against his broad chest. His short dark hair blended perfectly into the gathering shadows of the coming night. He watched his loyal soldiers assemble with a cold, hollow emptiness inside his chest. He was sending hundreds of his brave men into a completely senseless and brutal war. He was breaking the sacred vows he swore to the moon goddess when he took the crown. All of this destruction was happening because he was too arrogant to see the immense value of a quiet, steady love. He gripped the cold stone railing until his knuckles turned completely white. He would cross the forbidden river long before the dawn arrived. He would march directly into the wild and face whatever terrible consequences awaited him. Meanwhile, I sat comfortably and peacefully in my hidden, firelit cave. The wind outside began to howl with renewed and terrifying violence. It sounded almost like a chorus of desperately mourning wolves. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the cool, solid stone wall. I wondered briefly if Caleb had finally realized the massive magnitude of his fatal mistake. I wondered if the agonizing pain of the severed bond had finally brought him to his knees. A very small, dark part of my soul genuinely hoped that he was suffering endlessly. But I quickly and deliberately pushed that bitter, unproductive thought away. Holding on to anger was just another invisible chain tying me to his heavy throne. I needed total, absolute indifference to achieve true and lasting freedom. I simply added another dry branch to the blazing, comforting fire. I was no longer afraid of the dark or the cruel monsters that lived within it. Let the Alpha King come with his huge armies and his pathetic regrets. He would quickly learn that the gentle girl he cast aside no longer existed. The heavy, rhythmic thud of marching boots completely shattered the peaceful silence of the ancient wilderness. Hundreds of elite royal guards crossed the frozen river before the winter sun had even fully risen. They carried sharp steel weapons and proudly bore the dark, imposing banners of the Alpha King. But this was absolutely not a glorious military conquest or a proud defense of the noble realm. It was the pathetic, desperately sad crusade of a completely broken man chasing a lost ghost. I stood calmly at the high, rocky entrance of my stone cave, looking down at the snowy valley below. The bitter, freezing winter wind whipped my long, wild hair violently around my calm face. I did not try to run away or hide in the shadows from the massive, approaching army. I had absolutely nothing left to fear from Caleb or his violent, emotionally stunted world. A massive, terrifying pitch-black wolf burst fiercely through the dense, snow-covered tree line. It shifted mid-stride, heavy bones cracking and rapidly reforming into a very familiar human shape. Caleb stood at the base of the rocky hill, breathing heavily in the freezing, sharp morning air. He still possessed that incredibly tall, brutally muscular physique that dominated our entire fierce pack. His dark, short hair was normally perfectly styled, but now it was deeply matted with dried sweat and snow. He wore his heavy black battle armor, a dark suit specifically designed to deflect the sharpest deadly blades. Yet, no amount of thick forged steel could protect him from the devastating, soul-crushing agony of a severed mate bond. He looked directly up at me, and his glowing amber eyes were completely unrecognizable. They were entirely stripped of his legendary arrogance, his cold calculated logic, and his terrifying royal authority. They were the desperate, severely bloodshot eyes of a starving, dying creature begging for a single drop of water. The elite royal guards emerged cautiously from the trees behind him, forming a tight, totally silent semicircle in the deep snow. They watched in absolute, paralyzed disbelief as their previously invincible sovereign took a slow, trembling step forward. Evelyn, his deep, unnaturally raspy voice broke the heavy, oppressive silence of the snowy valley. It did not sound like a powerful royal command, it sounded exactly like a fractured, agonizing, pathetic prayer. I looked down at his tall figure with a perfectly steady and completely blank, emotionless expression. My heart did absolutely not flutter, and my freezing hands did not shake in the slightest. You deliberately crossed the forbidden boundary, Alpha, I stated calmly, my clear voice easily carrying over the freezing wind. You have foolishly risked a catastrophic, bloody war just to stand in front of my isolated cave. Caleb let out a shaky, incredibly desperate breath and took another hesitant, clumsy step up the rocky incline. I do not care about the cursed ancient boundaries or the worthless, stupid treaties, he rasped, his voice dripping with raw desperation. I only care about you. He finally reached the flat, snowy stone ledge where I stood perfectly, unapologetically still. This incredibly strong, traditionally dominant alpha king suddenly collapsed completely onto the frozen, hard ground. He fell heavily to his bruised knees, violently bowing his proud, short-haired head before my bare, freezing feet. Loud gasps of pure, unfiltered shock instantly erupted from the disciplined ranks of his assembled soldiers below. No one in the entire history of the pack had ever seen the great Alpha King kneel for anyone, not even the ancient gods. Please, Caleb choked out pitifully, his massive, broad shoulders trembling uncontrollably beneath his dark, heavy armor. Please, Evelyn, I was entirely, fundamentally wrong about absolutely everything. He slowly raised his head, and I saw actual, genuine tears streaming rapidly down his harsh, angular face. The permanent severing of the golden bond is literally killing me slowly from the inside out. I cannot breathe properly, I cannot think clearly, and I absolutely cannot rule my kingdom without you by my side. He reached out with a violently shaking, heavily scarred hand, desperately wanting to touch the dirty hem of my ruined silk dress. I smoothly took a single, highly deliberate step backward, coldly denying him even that incredibly small, pathetic comfort. The total, unflinching rejection in my simple movement hit him noticeably harder than a physical, brutal blow to the chest. You explicitly demanded a ruthless, violent warrior forged in fresh blood, I reminded him, my tone completely devoid of any lingering sympathy. You stood arrogantly in front of the entire pack and publicly declared I was far too weak to be your chosen Luna. You selfishly chose your massive, fragile ego and your cold, calculating logic over the sacred, rare bond given to us by the moon. Caleb squeezed his amber eyes shut, letting out a pitiful, heartbreaking sob that loudly echoed off the high stone walls. I was a blind, arrogantly foolish monster, he wept openly, utterly destroying his own terrifying reputation right in front of his loyal men. I will personally slaughter the remaining old elders who maliciously poisoned my vulnerable mind. I will gladly strip off this heavy, worthless crown and lay my entire vast kingdom right at your beautiful feet. Just please, I am begging you on my knees, let me try to mend the broken golden thread between us. I stared down at this pathetic, totally broken shell of a man who once carelessly held my entire young heart in his cruel hands. I felt a strange, profoundly deep sense of absolute, unwavering closure slowly wash over my entirely healed soul. The ultimate, most satisfying revenge was not aggressively screaming, violently fighting, or actively trying to destroy his wealthy kingdom. The ultimate, devastating revenge was the absolute, undeniable truth that I simply did not love him anymore. The golden thread is completely, permanently gone, Caleb, I said softly, delivering the final, unapologetically fatal blow to his spirit. You cannot magically mend a spiritual bond that has been completely erased from all existence by your own hubris. His tear-filled amber eyes flew wide open in pure, unadulterated terror as the absolute finality of my calm words finally sank into his brain. No, he whispered frantically, violently shaking his handsome, short-haired head in absolute, desperate denial. You absolutely cannot mean that. You are my fated mate, you belong permanently with me. I belong to absolutely no one in this world but myself, I corrected him with an unwavering, beautifully unbreakable inner strength. You arrogantly threw away a perfectly genuine diamond because you were far too foolish to see its true, enduring value. Now you are left with absolutely nothing but cold, bleeding hands and a totally empty, meaningless throne. I confidently turned my back on the weeping Alpha King, the exact same cruel way he had turned his back on my dignity in the Grand Hall. "Go back home, Caleb," I ordered coldly over my shoulder without an ounce of hesitation. "Take your totally silent, shocked armies and immediately leave my peaceful wilderness. If you ever attempt to follow me again, I will absolutely not hesitate to end your miserable, pathetic life myself." I did not wait for his pathetic, blubbering response, nor did I care if he continued to cry helplessly in the freezing snow. I walked confidently and gracefully back into the dark, incredibly comforting depths of my quiet stone cave. Behind me, an earth-shattering, soul-destroying scream of pure, absolute agony violently tore through the pale winter sky. It was the intensely tragic sound of a mighty, unbeatable king who had finally realized his absolute, irreversible defeat. He would unfortunately live the rest of his extremely long, immortal life entirely consumed by the bitter, acidic poison of deep regret. He would physically rule his vast, wealthy lands, but his broken spirit would remain completely starved and eternally empty. I sat down comfortably by my remarkably warm, crackling fire, feeling perfectly safe and completely, beautifully whole. I had easily survived the absolute darkest, most cruel winter of my entire young life. Now, I was a fiercely free, stunningly beautiful queen ruling over a spectacular world entirely of my own independent making.